recording. Okay, now in this first part of this lecture, what we're looking at is, hang on, I'm just gonna, sorry. So in the first part of this lecture, what we're looking at is just defining human rights. What are human rights and what do they mean? So in terms of the definition of human rights, we have what can maybe be termed like a more kind of natural rights definition. Human rights, the rights you have just because you're human. Now this is based on an idea that there's like a universal understanding and a universal set of values around what human rights are. That we all know what's good and what's bad and so on. Now to a certain extent this is true, that there are kind of universal ideas and good and bad, but that doesn't kind of answer everything. You know, while murder is universally seen to be bad, and I don't know, the rights to marry are universally seen to be good, there are always going to be parts of human rights which don't have that universal value. You know, for example, the right to marry in same-sex marriage is not universally agreed around the world. So the simple definition is good, but it's not as accurate as it could be. Still, in terms of just discussing what human rights are, the human rights, the rights that one has just because they're human, covers a lot of the meaning. If you're human, you should get these rights no matter what, no matter where, no matter how. But what it doesn't cover is the more, what we may call the more positive sense of human rights. That is, that human rights are constructed. They are created by certain groups and certain people. They do emerge out of current values and current politics. And that's why human rights are in internationally agreed standards about how states should treat their people. So this is kind of, it's more accurate, but it doesn't, but it kind of gets away from the idea that there is something more important about human rights. So, because we know that human rights come out of, like there is a list of human rights. We've got these 9 core treaties, which I've mentioned before, and they are the standards of human rights. And all countries around the world agree in one way or another with various elements of those 9 treaties of human rights. Every country in the world agrees of the rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But still, human rights are not static. You know, human rights do evolve and change over time. The human rights that existed in 1948 are quite different to the human rights that exist now. Because we have things like the addition of women's rights, children's rights, migrant workers' rights, disabled people's rights, refugee rights, and so on. And that's because states around the world gradually agree to these rights and incorporate them as human rights. And that's why we see things such as rights around sexual orientation and gender identity. Maybe human rights in some countries, but they're not at the international level. There's not like an international agreed standard of human rights around sexual orientation and gender identity. There will be one day, but not quite yet. Okay, so that's important about the definitions. Now, if we look at the definition of a human right as a right you have because you're human, it means you've really got to define what's a human and what's a right. Now, what is a human? This is relatively easy, in that we all know the difference between a human and a chair and a cat, say. That we all know that there is a distinct group, there is a distinct type of animal called a human. But there are still kind of challenges around this idea about what is a human in terms of different interpretation about when humans become humans. Is it upon birth or upon conception? And this relates to, say, the termination of pregnancies and the rights to abortion, because those kind of come back to, if you think that baby inside a woman is part of the woman or is its own human, that each country kind of recognizes at a certain point that fetus or that baby becomes a human. So there are sort of debates around that in terms of humans. There are also debates around when kind of humanity ends, in terms of what makes a human in terms of their consciousness, their conscience, and their rationality. Because we know that if there's an accident and someone is brain dead and you turn off the life support systems, that's not considered murder, because it's not considered like a full human person if their brain doesn't work. Similarly, if someone has a severe mental illness where they can't function properly in society, they may lose many of their human rights in terms of freedom and, say, rights to vote and so on. It doesn't mean they're not human. We recognize that because they don't have that full capacity, they can't be considered human. fully, they don't get all their human rights. Same things around if they don't have the kind of conscience and they're, you know, they're kind of mad and they want to kill everyone. We recognize that maybe they're not being human and some of their rights can be taken away as well. So being human is just not a purely biological thing. It's also, in a sense, how they act and how they think. You know, they must have some sense of conscience. They must have some sense of mental capacity to be considered a human. Now, these are kind of fringe areas because 99.9% of people, we know when they're a human. We know when they start, when they live, and when they die, when their humanity starts and when it stops. But in some areas, say around termination of pregnancy, around turning off life support, there are some questions about when humanity ends. Now, next is a much more tricky concept about what is a right, because the concept of right itself is quite complex. Why is a right a right? You know, when someone says, you know, I have a right to this, or isn't it my right to do this? We kind of understand, we know what it is, but trying to explain what it is can be quite difficult. So a right is something, we can define a right is, in some ways it's quite simple to explain, particularly in the English language. Because in the English language, you have a right because it's the right thing, because it seemed to be correct. And this is not a coincidence. A right is a right because it seemed to be the right thing. It's rights morally or socially or legally. You get that right because it seemed to be the right thing. So a right is something which is due to you, which you deserve, which you should have, because it is seen to be rational or legal or social or moral in some way. Now, there's a whole variety of rights. Like we have our legal rights, like our ability to marry or drive a car or to own property. We have various social rights in terms of access to health and education. Of course, we have our human rights, but we have student rights and consumer rights and so on. Now, some rights are legally enforced and other rights aren't. So the right, you know, of your girlfriend or your boyfriend not to kind of date someone else, that's not against the law if they do, but it's seen to be morally right or morally wrong. Much like you don't, you know, tell your friends secrets behind their back. It seemed to be the wrong thing to do. Not illegal, but it seemed to be some kind of moral right that your privacy is your privacy. Okay, so it means that with a right, there's a few parts to that. A right is based on some kind of value, which makes it right. A right is something that, you know, you have as a person. But you know, animals have their rights, companies have their rights, universities and states have their rights as well. So many different things and objects can have rights. But what we're looking here in terms of human rights is the right that a human has. Now, the more complex definition of that, and this does look kind of a bit complex, but it's important to go through these elements just to kind of break down the different components of a right. So we have A, which is the rights holder. That right holder could be you as a student, or you as a citizen, or you as a consumer, or you as a human. It could be a company may have certain rights. It could be an animal may have certain rights. Now then we've got the right itself, what that subject to the right is. The right to water, or the right to freedom of expression, or the right to buy good food at a healthy food at a shop. And next, importantly, we have the duty bearer. A right is only a right if someone has a duty to respect that right. Okay. That's why we talk about, we say for every right, there's a correlative duty bearer. Correlative or to correlate means that to have a right means that someone else has a duty. And that's because you need to have that right to protect yourself from the duty bearer. Okay? If there's no duty bearer, then it's not really a right. So for example, gravity is not a right. No one has to provide us gravity, it's just there. Same thing with air. Air is not really a right. No one has to provide us air, it's just not there. Only when there's some sort of duty, like to provide, say, clean air, or to provide fresh air at in a classroom, does that become a right. So, because you need, the whole reason that you have a right is to ensure that that's something which is protected from that duty bearer. Okay, so that makes sense. right is only a right if there's someone who has a duty to respect that right. So for example, you know, human rights, the duty bearer is primarily the state. You have that right of freedom of expression or right to political participation or equal before the law against the state who has to recognize that right. Okay. And so the relationship of human rights is primarily with the state. But also remember, everyone has duties in terms of human rights. So you have rights to your friends in terms of respecting their freedom of expression or their right, freedom of movement or their non-discrimination, for example. So other people have rights. Other people have duties. Companies have duties. Universities have duties. Hospitals have duties. So everyone is a rights holder, but also simultaneously we are duty bearers. The big distinction, of course, is that the state is legally bound by the human rights duties, whereas we're always not clearly legally bound by the human rights duties. Okay, then the last one is the reason for that right. You know, what makes that right the right thing? Why is that right right? Okay, and that can be a moral reason, a social reason, an economic reason, a political reason, or in terms of human rights, it can be like that, the idea of it's just natural, which is maybe not the best argument, or the idea that it's a political agreement. It's like, because you're human, you deserve this and state should treat you that way. Okay, so it's important to kind of break down human rights into these categories to know that there are rights. If we understand a right, we've got to identify who's the rights holder and who's the duty bearer, what specifically that right is, and what's the reason for having that right. Okay, so we've covered this. So a duty, there's always a duty and a duty bearer there. Duty bearers have that, so all rights have a correlative duty. So I'm sorry, that for every right, there's a correlative duty bearer. So there's a relationship between them. Now, next, some duties are positive, which is the duty to do something, and some duties are negative, which is the duty to do nothing. So in terms of human rights, the positive right is like the right to education, in which there's a duty of the state to provide a school. So it's a positive duty, the duty to do something. But some rights are negative, like freedom from torture and freedom from slavery, means that the state should not do anything. The state should not torture you or should not enslave you. So that's known as a negative right, the right not to interfere. Okay. So duties, some duties are duties to do something, some duties are duties to do nothing, to not interfere. Okay, I think that's it. So let me just stop the recording there. Sorry.